Sarah Mitchell's hands trembled as she sat on the cold wooden bench outside the courtroom, the fluorescent lights above casting harsh shadows across her pale face. She held a worn photograph of Emma, her 3-year-old daughter, the light of her life, between shaking fingers. The edges of the photo were creased from countless moments of being pulled out, stared at, and tucked away again. 18 months. That's how long she had been separated from her baby. 18 months of supervised visits that felt like daggers to her heart. 18 months of lying awake at night wondering if her daughter was sleeping okay. 18 months of questioning every decision she'd ever made. The courthouse hallway was nearly empty. A few other people sat scattered along the benches, each lost in their own legal battles, their own personal crises. Sarah recognized the universal look of desperation in their eyes because she saw it in the mirror every morning. She wore her best dress, the navy blue one she'd bought specifically for this day, hoping that if she looked pulled together, if she looked stable and competent, then maybe the judge would see past the mistakes of her past. Her hair was carefully styled, her makeup applied with precision. Every detail mattered, every impression counted. The tile floor beneath her feet was worn and stained from decades of people like her, people fighting for their futures, their families, their second chances. Sarah's attorney, David, had gone to grab coffee before the hearing. He was a good man, one of the few people who had believed in her when nobody else did. David had listened to her story without judgment, had seen the photographs of her apartment, had met her new friends and her employer. He had examined her therapy records, 12 months of intensive counseling, working through the depression and anxiety that had haunted her for years. He had reviewed her employment history at the marketing firm, the steady paycheck, the excellent performance reviews. But even David couldn't promise her anything. Family law, he'd explained, was unpredictable. Judges were human, and humans could be swayed by fear, by the compelling narrative, by the words of a skilled opposing counsel. Sarah closed her eyes and let herself remember the early days with Emma when everything had felt possible. She had been so young when Emma was born, only 24 years old, but she had loved that baby with an intensity that surprised her. In the hospital, when the nurse placed Emma in her arms for the first time, Sarah had wept. This perfect, beautiful creature was hers. She had made this. In those early months, despite the sleepless nights and the overwhelm of new motherhood, Sarah had been happy. Truly happy. But then the darkness had started creeping in. At first, it was subtle, just feeling tired even after sleeping, struggling to find joy in things that once brought her happiness. Sarah had recognized the signs of depression because her mother had struggled with it too. She had tried to hide it, tried to push through, tried to be the perfect mother. But depression doesn't negotiate with willpower. It's a thief that steals color from the world, that whispers lies about your worth, that convinces you that everyone would be better off without you. When Emma was 2, things had gotten worse. Sarah had gone through a particularly dark period where she'd felt almost unable to get out of bed. Mark, her husband at the time, had grown frustrated with her. He didn't understand mental illness. To him, she was being dramatic, seeking attention, making excuses. Their marriage had deteriorated rapidly. Arguments became more frequent and more bitter. Sarah remembered crying in the kitchen while Mark shouted that she was a terrible mother, that Emma deserved better, that her depression was just selfishness. The words had stuck in her mind like poisonous hooks. When Mark finally left, Sarah had hit rock bottom. She had spent 3 weeks barely functioning, existing on coffee and the bare minimum of self-care. A neighbor had eventually called Child Protective Services, worried about Emma's. It was the lowest moment of Sarah's life, but it had also been a turning point. Because instead of resisting help, Sarah had finally accepted it. She had checked herself into a mental health facility for 2 weeks, leaving Emma in temporary foster care. That decision, admitting she needed help, had been the hardest and the best thing she'd ever done. The rehabilitation process had been brutal. Therapy wasn't easy. It meant confronting painful truths about her childhood, about her relationship patterns, about her perfectionism and her tendency towards self-blame. But Sarah had committed to it completely. She took medication as prescribed. She attended every therapy session. She read self-help books. She joined a support group for women with depression. She had rebuilt her relationship with her employer, explaining her situation honestly and asking for reduced hours while she stabilized. Her boss, surprisingly, had been compassionate and flexible. 18 months ago, Mark had filed for custody, claiming Sarah was an unfit mother due to her mental health history. He had painted her depression as ongoing instability, as evidence that she would never be capable of caring for a child. The supervised visits had been his lawyer's idea, a way to document that Sarah's mental health issues made her an inadequate parent. Each visit with Emma had been observed by a court-appointed monitor who took notes. Sarah had felt like a specimen under a microscope, terrified that any moment of frustration or sadness would be used against her. The separation had been agonizing. Emma had been confused at first, asking when Mommy was coming home. Then over time she had seemed to understand that something was wrong. The visits had become more strained. Emma had grown clingy, then distant. Sarah had ached every single day with a pain that no medication could touch. But in the past year, Sarah had proven herself. Her therapist had written a glowing report. Her employer had provided documentation of her consistent, exemplary work performance. Her apartment was clean, well-organized, child-proofed. She had a support network, friends from her therapy group, her neighbor who had ultimately helped save her life, her older sister who had started speaking to her again. Most importantly, she had stayed medicated, stayed committed to her mental health, and maintained complete sobriety and stability. Today was the final hearing. Today, the judge would decide whether Sarah would get her daughter back or whether Mark would retain custody. Sarah had run through every possible scenario in her mind 1,000 times. She had imagined the judge ruling in her favor, imagined walking out with Emma held tight in her arms. But she had also imagined the worst, the gavel falling, the words she didn't want to hear, the slow death of hope that would follow. Her attorney appeared around the corner with 2 cups of coffee. "How are you feeling?" David asked, handing her a warm cup. Sarah couldn't answer. She just squeezed the cup and stared at Emma's photograph. David sat beside her in silence, sometimes the most supportive thing someone could do. After what felt like both an eternity and no time at all, the bailiff emerged from the courtroom and called Sarah's case. She stood on legs that didn't quite feel like they belonged to her. This was it. Everything she had fought for, everything she had rebuilt, everything she hoped for came down to the next few hours. As she walked toward those courtroom doors, Sarah whispered a prayer, a plea to the universe, to God, to fate, to anything that might listen. "Please let me bring my baby home." Courtroom was exactly as Sarah remembered from the preliminary hearings, imposing, sterile, and designed to make ordinary people feel small. High ceilings stretched above, creating an echo that made even whispers seem loud. The judge's bench loomed at the front like a throne, elevated above everyone else in the room as a physical reminder of who held the power. Sarah took her seat at the plaintiff's table beside David, her fingers interlaced so tightly her knuckles turned white. The opposing counsel sat across the aisle looking composed and confident. She wore an expensive suit that probably cost more than Sarah's entire monthly rent, and her hair was perfectly coiffed. She looked like someone accustomed to winning. Judge Richardson entered from her chambers and everyone stood. She was a woman in her late 60s with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her expression was neither warm nor cold. It was completely neutral, a professional mask that gave nothing away. Sarah had researched her extensively. Judge Richardson had a reputation for being fair but strict, for valuing evidence over emotion, and for having strong opinions about parental fitness. She had presided over hundreds of custody cases, and her decisions were rarely overturned on appeal. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on Sarah's chest like a physical force. "This is the final hearing in the custody matter of Mitchell v. Mitchell," Judge Richardson announced, her voice carrying through the courtroom with absolute authority. "We are here to determine primary custody of Emma Mitchell, age 3 years old. Counsel, Are you ready to proceed? The respondent is ready, Your Honor, stood smoothly, buttoning her jacket in a gesture that seemed designed to project confidence and control. David stood. The petitioner is ready, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Ms., you may present your case. What followed was in persuasive argumentation delivered with surgical precision. Walked to the center of the courtroom like she owned it, commanding attention with every movement. She began by laying out her narrative. Sarah Mitchell was a woman with a documented history of mental illness, a woman who had been unstable, a woman who had endangered her own child through neglect and inability to function as a parent. Your Honor, began, her voice measured and authoritative, the evidence will show that the respondent, Sarah Mitchell, has a chronic history of depression and anxiety. These are not minor issues. These are serious psychiatric conditions that directly impact a person's ability to provide consistent, reliable care to a vulnerable young child. She held up Sarah's medical records, pages and pages of documentation from therapy sessions, medication prescriptions, and the period of hospitalization. To the uninformed observer, it probably looked damning. Then called her first witness, Dr. Richard, a psychologist retained by Mark Mitchell. He was an older gentleman with an air of authority that seemed to fill the courtroom. Under questioning, Doctor, that Sarah's depression and anxiety were chronic and persistent conditions that could recur at any time. He suggested that Sarah's history of depressive episodes meant she would likely experience them again, potentially during critical moments when Emma needed her most. In your professional opinion, Doctor, asked smoothly, can someone with Sarah Mitchell's psychiatric history be a stable, reliable primary caregiver? It's certainly a risk factor, Doctor replied carefully. While people can manage mental illness, there's always the possibility of relapse or decompensation, especially during times of stress. A young child requires consistent, stable parenting. Any potential for instability is concerning. Sarah felt her chest tighten. The words sounded so clinical, so damning when stripped of context. They made her sound dangerous, unstable, irresponsible. David stood for cross-examination. Doctor, you've reviewed Ms. Mitchell's medical records for the past 12 months, correct? I have. And in those records, is there any documentation of a depressive episode or any psychiatric crisis during that time? Doctor hesitated. No, there isn't, but as I said, the history indicates a predisposition to. Thank you. A straightforward question. Is there any professional evidence that Ms. Mitchell has experienced any psychiatric instability in the past year? No, Doctor conceded reluctantly. But the damage had been done. The judge had heard the narrative wanted her to hear, that Sarah was fundamentally unstable. Next called Mark Mitchell himself. Emma's father was a handsome man in his mid-30s, dressed in an expensive suit, looking every bit the concerned parent. He had always been the more stable parent, that he had held down a successful career as a financial advisor while Sarah struggled. He described instances of Sarah's depression affecting her ability to care for Emma, forgetting to pack a diaper bag, being irritable, sleeping in when Emma needed breakfast. Emma deserves a parent who can show up every single day, Mark said, his voice tinged with what sounded like genuine concern. I want my daughter to be with her mother, but only if her mother is capable of providing the care she needs. I'm not trying to hurt Sarah. I'm trying to protect our daughter. It was masterful. He positioned himself as the reluctant truth-teller, the parent who didn't want to attack the other parent but had to because he was thinking of the child. Sarah felt tears threatening and forced them back. Crying in court would only confirm the narrative that she was unstable and emotional. When it was time for David to cross-examine, he tried to poke holes in Mark's testimony. Mr. Mitchell, you describe Ms. Mitchell's depression as affecting her parenting, but you never once took her to a doctor or suggested she get help, did you? I suggested it many times, Mark said calmly. She refused. Actually, David countered, pulling out his own document. According to Ms. Mitchell's insurance records, she requested treatment multiple times during your marriage, and you specifically asked her not to go to therapy because you said it was a waste of money. Is that accurate? Mark's composure flickered, but only briefly. I may have expressed concerns about the cost, yes, but I never prevented her from getting treatment. It was a small victory, but Sarah wasn't sure it was enough. Then presented documentation from the supervised visits, notes from the monitor describing moments when Sarah seemed distant or withdrawn. Every sigh, every moment of patient's fatigue was documented and presented as evidence of unsuitability. A trained observer with a predetermined narrative could make anyone look bad. By the time David stood to present Sarah's case, the courtroom atmosphere was heavy with doubt. Sarah felt it pressing down on her like a physical weight. She wanted to scream, wanted to stand up and tell her story herself, but she knew that wasn't how the system worked. She had to trust David. She had to trust that the truth would ultimately matter. David called Sarah's therapist, Dr. Jennifer, who had been working with her for 14 months. Doctor that Sarah had made remarkable progress, that she was medication compliant, that she showed genuine insight into her condition and how to manage it. She presented recent psychological evaluations showing significant improvement in Sarah's mental health indicators. In my professional opinion, Doctor stated firmly, Sarah Mitchell is a fit mother. She has taken responsibility for her illness, she has engaged fully in treatment, and she has demonstrated exceptional commitment to recovery. Many of my clients with similar histories don't work as hard or show as much progress. She's exemplary. Sarah's employer, Henderson, also describing Sarah as reliable and one of her best employees. A therapist friend Sarah had met through her support group to her character and her commitment to being a good mother. But as David finished his presentation, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it might not be enough. Judge Richardson had been taking notes throughout, her expression never changing. Sarah tried to read her face, looking for any sign of empathy or belief, but the judge revealed nothing. The closing arguments were brutal, painted Sarah as a woman taking risks with her daughters, a woman asking the court to trust that her mental illness wouldn't resurface. Can we really be sure? She asked rhetorically. And if we can't be sure, shouldn't we protect the child? David countered that recovery and stability were facts, not predictions. He presented the evidence of Sarah's year-long improvement, her job stability, her commitment to motherhood. Your Honor, he said in his closing statement, this case isn't about whether Sarah Mitchell has depression. It's about whether she is a fit mother today, right now. And the evidence is overwhelming that she is. As the judge called for a brief recess before her ruling, Sarah sat in the hallway again, waiting. Everything came down to the next few minutes. Everything, her future, Emma's future, hung in the balance. The recess was only supposed to last 15 minutes, but as Sarah sat in the hallway, it felt like an eternity. She couldn't eat, couldn't think, could barely breathe. David had stepped outside to take a phone call, leaving her alone with her spiraling thoughts. She stared at Emma's photograph again, running her thumb over the child's smiling face. What if the judge had already decided? What if all of this had been for nothing? Sarah's anxiety, the very condition that had been used against her in court, threatened to consume her completely. She was so lost in her thoughts that she almost didn't notice when the hallway doors opened with a gentle creak. But then she heard it, a sound so unexpected in this sterile, formal environment that her head snapped up immediately. It was the click of claws on the polished courtroom floor, a rhythmic, gentle sound that seemed almost musical compared to the harsh echo of footsteps. Officer Williams entered the hallway, and beside him walked the most beautiful golden retriever Sarah had ever seen. The dog was large but moved with an almost graceful elegance, his golden coat gleaming under the fluorescent lights like liquid honey. His dark eyes were intelligent and warm, reflecting a calmness that seemed almost supernatural in its serenity. The dog wore a special vest that read Therapy Animal County Support Services in official lettering. Sarah's breath caught. She had read about therapy dogs in her therapy sessions. Doctor had mentioned them as tools sometimes used in particularly emotional legal cases involving children. But she had never expected to see one here in her case at this moment. Officer Williams approached her with a gentle expression. "Ms. Mitchell, I'm Officer Williams. This is Justice, one of our county's certified therapy animals. Judge Richardson approved his presence in today's hearing to help provide support to your daughter during her testimony." He extended his hand, and Sarah shook it automatically, still processing what was happening. "I don't understand," Sarah whispered. "What does this mean?" "It means the judge wants to create the safest possible environment for Emma to communicate honestly," explained. "Justice is specially trained to sense emotional distress and provide comfort. He's been part of our victim support unit for 3 years and has helped in dozens of cases. Sometimes, when a child feels safe and supported, they're able to express their true feelings more clearly than through traditional testimony. The judge is giving Emma every opportunity to have her voice heard." Sarah felt tears beginning to form. Was this a good sign? Was Judge Richardson considering her case seriously enough to take these special measures? Or was it just standard procedure? She didn't dare hope too much, but something inside her chest seemed to shift. A tiny opening in the suffocating weight of anxiety that had been pressing down on her all day. Justice had noticed Sarah's emotional state immediately. Without any command from Officer Williams, the dog approached her slowly and deliberately. He placed his head gently against her knee, his warm presence somehow immediately calming. Sarah's hand moved to his golden fur almost involuntarily, and the moment her fingers touched his coat, something shifted in her. The warmth of his body, the steadiness of his breathing, the unconditional acceptance in his dark eyes. It was as if Justice understood everything she couldn't put into words. "He knows," said softly, watching the interaction with professional understanding. "Animals have an incredible ability to sense emotional pain. Justice has worked with hundreds of people, but he's particularly drawn to those who are suffering." David emerged from the hallway corner and stopped short when he saw Justice. His eyes widened, and then his expression became thoughtful. "Is this?" he began. "The judge approved a therapy animal for the child's testimony," explained. "Justice will be present to help Emma feel safe." David looked at Sarah, and she saw hope flickering across his face. "This is actually very good news," he said carefully. "Judge Richardson wouldn't have approved this unless she was taking Emma's emotional state seriously. She's giving your daughter every opportunity to communicate her true feelings." The bailiff appeared in the courtroom doorway. "We're ready to resume," she announced. As they filed back into the courtroom, Justice walked beside Officer Williams with perfect composure. Sarah noticed how his presence immediately affected the atmosphere in the room. People who had been fidgeting in their seats became still. Those who had been whispering fell silent. There was something almost sacred about having an animal in this typically sterile legal environment, something that seemed to soften the harsh edges of the adversarial process. Judge Richardson looked up from her bench and observed Justice's entrance with an expression that Sarah couldn't quite read. But there was something in her eyes, a recognition, perhaps, of the significance of what was about to happen. "The court is back in session," the judge announced. "Before we proceed with the child's testimony, I want to explain the presence of Justice for the record. This therapy animal has been approved to be present to provide emotional support to the minor, Emma Mitchell, during her testimony. The animal is trained to respond to emotional distress and provide comfort. This is a reasonable accommodation to ensure that the child can communicate in the safest possible environment. Does counsel have any objections?" "Stood, Your Honor. I would object to the presence of an animal as potentially biasing to the child's testimony or—" "Your objection is noted and overruled," Judge Richardson said firmly. "In my experience, therapy animals facilitate honest communication from children rather than hinder it. We will proceed." Sarah watched as Justice was positioned beside the witness stand, where Emma would soon testify. Officer Williams sat near the dog, keeping the leash loose, allowing Justice the freedom to move if Emma needed him. The arrangement created a small island of comfort in the midst of the formal, intimidating courtroom structure. Mark Mitchell sat in the gallery, and Sarah was surprised to see his expression soften slightly as he watched Justice take his position. Even he seemed affected by the dog's calming presence. There was something about an animal's unconditional, non-judgmental acceptance that transcended the conflict and division that legal proceedings created. The bailiff went to retrieve Emma from the waiting area where she had been supervised by a court-appointed worker. Sarah's heart began to race as she heard small footsteps in the hallway. Her daughter, her baby. In just moments, Emma would be in this courtroom, answering questions about her life, about where she felt safe, about her mother. And this dog, this beautiful, calm, intuitive animal, would be there to help her feel safe enough to tell the truth. Justice seemed to sense the significance of the moment as well. His ears perked up slightly, his entire body becoming even more alert and present. Officer Williams kept one hand on his vest, ready to provide gentle guidance if needed, but allowing the dog the agency to respond naturally to what was about to unfold. The courtroom fell into a profound silence. Everyone understood that they were about to witness something important, a moment where a child's authentic voice would be heard, supported not by legal arguments or strategic testimony, but by the simple, pure presence of an animal whose only purpose was to provide comfort and safety. In a legal system that often felt cold and adversarial, Justice's presence represented something different, a possibility that truth could be revealed not through conflict, but through compassion. As Emma's small figure appeared in the courtroom doorway, led by a court official, Sarah held her breath. Her daughter looked small and frightened, her eyes wide as she took in the formal, imposing space. But then Emma's gaze found Justice, and something flickered across the little girl's face, a recognition of something safe, something good, something that didn't require her to be afraid. The stage was set. The moment everyone had been waiting for was about to arrive. Emma Mitchell was lifted onto the specially modified witness chair by the court official, her small legs swinging several inches above the ground. At 3 years old, she was impossibly tiny in a space designed for adults. The chair had been adjusted with cushions to help her feel more secure, but she still looked dwarfed by the formality of the courtroom. Her hair, the same shade as Sarah's, was pulled back in a pink bow. She wore a simple dress with flowers embroidered on it, the dress Sarah had bought her for her 3rd birthday, a celebration Sarah had only been able to witness during a supervised visit. Emma's eyes darted nervously around the courtroom, taking in the high ceilings, the stern-faced judge, the sea of unfamiliar adults. Her thumb instinctively moved toward her mouth, that universal gesture of childhood anxiety and self-soothing. Sarah watched from the plaintiff's table, her entire body tense with the weight of the moment. This was her daughter. This was the child she had been separated from, the person she loved more than her own life. And Emma looked terrified. The guardian ad, a woman named in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes, approached the witness stand carefully. She had been assigned to represent Emma's interests, to speak for the child whose voice often went unheard in legal proceedings. Had spent several hours in recent weeks getting to know Emma, building rapport, and preparing the little girl for this moment. But no amount of preparation could completely ease the anxiety of testifying in a formal courtroom. "Hello, Emma," said softly, positioning herself at the child's eye level rather than standing above her. "Do you remember me? We had tea together last week with the dolls." Emma nodded barely perceptibly, her eyes remaining wide and uncertain. "Emma, I'm going to ask you some questions today, and I want you to know that there are no wrong answers. You can tell me how you really feel. Okay?" Another small nod. Judge Richardson leaned forward slightly. "Emma, do you understand that you're in a courtroom, that I'm a judge?" Emma didn't respond verbally. She just stared up at the judge, her small face etched with confusion and fear. Continued gently, Emma, we're here because we want to know about you, about where you live, about the people who take care of you. Would you like to tell me about that? There was a long silence. Emma's thumb moved closer to her mouth. Sarah felt her heart breaking watching her daughter struggle. This little girl had done nothing wrong, yet she was caught in the middle of adult conflict, forced to navigate a system that wasn't designed with children's in mind. "Where do you live?" Emma asked. Emma's voice was so quiet it was barely audible. "With Daddy." "And who else lives with Daddy?" "Nobody, just Daddy and the nanny sometimes." Sarah felt those words like a physical blow. Emma lived with Mark and a nanny, a stranger hired to care for her while Mark worked long hours at his financial firm. Sarah had known this intellectually, had heard it discussed in legal documents, but hearing it from Emma's own mouth made it devastatingly real. "Do you see Mommy?" asked carefully. Emma nodded but didn't elaborate. The guardian waited patiently, understanding that rushing children through testimony often resulted in less honest communication. "When do you see Mommy?" prompted. "Sometimes at the place. The lady watches." The place was referring to the supervised visitation center where Sarah had been allowed to see Emma. The lady was the monitor who documented every interaction. Emma had been old enough to understand that something was different about these visits, that they were observed, formal, not like normal visits with a parent. "Does Mommy make you feel happy?" asked. Emma looked directly at her mother for the first time, and Sarah's breath caught. Their eyes met, and Sarah saw the conflict in her daughter's expression, the desire to run to her mother warring with the fear and confusion of the separation. "Yes," Emma said softly, "but then Mommy goes away." The words were simple, but they contained a world of pain. Sarah had to grip the edge of the table to keep from standing up and running to her daughter. David placed a hand on her arm, a subtle gesture warning her to maintain composure. "Does Daddy make you feel happy?" continued. "Daddy is busy," Emma said matter-of-factly. "He works all the time. The nanny gives me snacks and watches movies with me." It was a devastating portrait of a little girl who spent her days with a hired caregiver while her father worked, and her mother remained separated from her by court order. Emma had been describing her life with clinical simplicity, but the picture it painted was one of a child who was being cared for physically, but perhaps not emotionally connected to either parent in the way she needed. Stood for her cross-examination. "Emma, does Mommy ever get sad?" Emma hesitated. She was being asked to characterize her mother's emotional state, a complex task for a 3-year-old who didn't have the vocabulary or cognitive ability to understand mental illness. "Sometimes Mommy cries," Emma said finally, "at the place." It was true. During the supervised visits, Sarah had occasionally struggled to hold back tears, tears of longing, of frustration at the artificial nature of the visits, of desperate love for her daughter. Now those tears, which had emerged from her pain and her profound need for her child, were being used against her. "Does Mommy's sadness scare you?" asked. I don't know," Emma said, her voice becoming smaller. Sarah watched her daughter struggle to answer questions she couldn't possibly be expected to understand at her age. Was essentially asking Emma to describe complex adult emotions and determine whether her mother's mental health made her a danger. It was unfair on every level, but Emma, sensing the importance of the moment, was trying desperately to answer correctly. Intervened gently. "Emma, let me ask you something. When you're with Mommy, does she take good care of you?" "Yes," Emma said. "She gives me hugs, and she reads me stories, and she makes sure I have everything I need." "And how does that make you feel?" "Happy, safe," Emma said, and then more quietly, "sad too, because I have to leave." The courtroom was deathly silent. There wasn't a person present who wasn't moved by the child's honest answer, an answer that captured the entire tragedy of the situation. Emma loved her mother. She felt safe with her mother, but the legal system had made it so that she couldn't be with her mother, and that separation was causing her genuine emotional pain. Judge Richardson made a note on her pad, and Sarah tried to read her expression, but it remained carefully neutral. Continued her questioning, asking Emma about her daily routines, her likes and dislikes, her friendships her favorite foods. The questions became less pointed, more designed to help Emma feel more comfortable in the space. But throughout her answers, Emma seemed anxious, searching, as if she was trying to say something but couldn't quite find the words. Her small legs swung against the witness chair cushion as she answered questions about her preschool. Her voice remained quiet, sometimes trembling slightly. She looked exhausted by the effort of trying to articulate her experience in ways that adults could understand and use to make decisions about her life. Asked a few more pointed questions designed to emphasize Sarah's mental health issues and their impact on Emma. David's follow-up questions tried to reframe Emma's statements to show her deep attachment to and need for her mother. But throughout all of it, Emma seemed increasingly overwhelmed, increasingly uncomfortable. By the time finished her questioning, Emma looked drained. She was slumping in the chair, her eyes drooping slightly. The ordeal of testifying, of being the center of attention, of being asked to describe complex family dynamics she couldn't possibly fully understand, had exhausted her. Reached out and gently patted Emma's arm. "You did a very good job, Emma. You answered all the questions very honestly." But even as the guardian tried to reassure the little girl, Emma's eyes had shifted. She was looking past the judge, past all the adults who were using her testimony to make their legal arguments. She was looking at something across the courtroom, something that had caught her attention and suddenly seemed far more important than any of the questions being asked of her. Her body shifted slightly in the chair. Her eyes widened, and then her lips parted and she seemed about to say something, not an answer to a legal question but something genuine, something that came from deep within her scared, confused heart. Emma's eyes locked onto Justice with an intensity that transcended the formal courtroom setting. For the first time all day, her fearful expression transformed into something else entirely: recognition, wonder, pure unburdened joy. The therapy dog was sitting calmly beside Officer Williams, as he had been throughout Emma's testimony, but the little girl was only now noticing him. It was as if she had suddenly seen a light in the darkness that had surrounded her all morning. "Doggy," Emma's voice rang out through the courtroom, not in the quiet, hesitant tone she had been using throughout her testimony, but in a clear, excited exclamation that seemed to break through every wall of fear and confusion she had been constructing. "Doggy, doggy, doggy." The word echoed in the formal space, and Sarah felt tears immediately spring to her eyes. It was the first genuine, unguarded moment of joy she had witnessed from her daughter in months. Emma wasn't thinking about the judge, wasn't worried about saying the right thing, wasn't navigating the complex politics of adults fighting over custody. In that moment, Emma was simply a little girl who had just noticed the most beautiful, calming creature and couldn't contain her delight. The guardian ad looked startled by Emma's sudden outburst, but she was smiling. Even she seemed to understand that this was significant. This was the real Emma breaking through the anxiety and confusion. Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at Justice. The golden retriever's ears perked up slightly at the sound of Emma's voice. His tail, which had been resting peacefully against the floor, began to move slowly back and forth. Officer Williams looked at Judge Richardson, silently asking permission with his eyes. The judge, whose expression had remained carefully neutral throughout the day, allowed herself the slightest nod. Officer Williams stood smoothly and began walking Justice across the courtroom toward the witness stand. The dog moved with the same graceful, deliberate pace he had maintained all day, as if he understood the profound importance of this moment. Every eye followed the pair's movement. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension and legal argumentation, seemed to hold its collective breath. Sarah watched this unfold and felt something shift inside her chest. She had read about moments like this in articles about therapy animals, Moments when an animal's presence seemed to unlock something essential in a person, especially in traumatized or overwhelmed children. But witnessing it in real time, seeing it happen to her own daughter, was something entirely different. Emma leaned forward in the witness chair, her small hands gripping the edges of the cushion. Her entire body was animated now, alive in a way it hadn't been since she entered the courtroom. "Can I pet him?" she asked, her voice trembling with hope and eagerness. Officer Williams positioned Justice so that the dog's head was at approximately the same height as Emma's small hands. "Go ahead," he said gently. "Justice loves children." Emma reached out and her tiny fingers made contact with Justice's golden fur. The moment her skin touched the dog's coat, something profound seemed to happen. Emma's expression shifted, and her rigid posture, the defensive tension she had been maintaining, suddenly crumbled like a structure that had been under impossible strain. Her chin quivered slightly. Sarah held her breath. She recognized this look. She had seen it before, in moments when Emma's brave facade had finally given way to genuine emotion. And then Emma began to cry. But these weren't the quiet whimpers of a confused child. These were deep, body-shaking sobs that seemed to come from a place far deeper than conscious thought. Emma was crying with her whole being, her shoulders heaving, her face crumpling, tears streaming down her cheeks. The 3-year-old was releasing something that had been locked inside her for months, something that had been too big and too complicated for her to articulate through words. Justice responded immediately, as if he had been trained for exactly this moment, which, in a sense, he had been. The dog pressed his head more firmly against Emma's hands, offering his presence as an anchor in the storm of emotion. His breathing remained steady and calm, a physical reminder that safety existed, that not everything in the world was chaotic or frightening. Sarah found herself standing, unable to remain seated, unable to contain her response to watching her daughter finally let herself feel everything she had been holding back. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as well. David placed a steadying hand on her arm, but he didn't try to make her sit back down. Even he seemed to understand that this moment transcended courtroom protocol. The entire gallery seemed affected. People who had been sitting in reserved silence were now openly crying. Sarah saw Mark wipe his eyes. Even some of the court staff seemed moved, maintaining their professional composure but clearly affected by the rawness of the child's emotion. Judge Richardson set down her pen and simply watched. Her expression, which had been carefully neutral all day, now showed something different, a deep attention, a recognition that something genuinely important was happening in her courtroom. This wasn't a legal argument or a piece of evidence to be weighed. This was raw, authentic human emotion, and it carried a weight that no expert testimony could replicate. Stood quietly, giving Emma space to feel what she needed to feel. She didn't try to comfort the child or stop the tears. She simply remained present, understanding that sometimes crying was exactly what a person needed to do. Emma's sobs continued for several minutes, each wave seeming to release something deeper. Justice remained steady, his presence unchanging, his acceptance unconditional. The dog didn't try to stop Emma's tears or fix her pain. He simply held space for it, allowing the little girl to finally, fully express the confusion and longing and loss she had been experiencing. As Emma's sobs gradually began to subside, she kept one hand on Justice's head, her fingers stroking his fur in slow, repetitive motions. The act of touching the dog seemed to be calming her, grounding her in the present moment. Officer Williams handed a box of tissues, which she gently offered to Emma. "It's okay to be sad," said softly. "Justice is here, I'm here. Everyone here cares about you, Emma." Emma looked up with tears streaming down her face, her lips trembling. "I want my mommy," she said, her voice small and broken and completely honest. "I want to go home with my mommy." The statement hung in the courtroom like a bell that had just been rung. It was simple. It was clear. It was the unmistakable voice of a child expressing a fundamental need, the need to be with her mother, to return to the person who provided her with safety and love and comfort. Sarah made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and turned away, unable to contain her response. David's hand on her arm became more of a physical anchor as waves of emotion crashed through her. 18 months of separation, 18 months of fighting, 18 months of wondering if she would ever hold her daughter again. And now Emma was expressing the truth that had been hidden beneath legal arguments and court procedures. Sat with her lips pressed into a thin line, her earlier confidence seeming to have evaporated. Whatever narrative she had been constructing was being fundamentally challenged by a 3-year-old's honest confession delivered through her tears. Judge Richardson made notes, and this time her pen moved with deliberate purpose. There was something about witnessing a child's genuine, unfiltered emotional truth that seemed to cut through all the legal complexity and expose what really mattered. Emma continued to stroke Justice's fur, and the dog remained perfectly still, perfectly present. In that moment, the therapy dog wasn't just providing comfort to Emma. He was performing a function that the legal system often failed to achieve. He was allowing a child's authentic voice to be heard, not filtered through adult interpretations or strategic questioning, but pure and raw and absolutely true. The courtroom remained silent except for the sound of Emma's gradually slowing sobs and the soft rustle of tissues. Everyone understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a moment when a small child's love for her mother had pierced through months of separation and legal proceedings, and forced everyone in the room to confront the human reality beneath the case files and arguments. Justice's presence had unlocked something that neither lawyer nor judge nor any expert witness could have unlocked, the unvarnished truth of a child's heart. Judge Richardson set down her pen deliberately and looked out over the courtroom. Her expression had changed. The professional mask had been temporarily set aside, replaced by something more human, more real. "We will take a 30-minute recess," she announced, her voice carrying a weight that suggested this break was far more significant than a simple pause in proceedings. "Bailiff, please ensure that Emma is given time to compose herself and have some water. Court reconvenes in 30 minutes. As the judge rose and exited to her chambers, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. Sarah found herself moving without conscious thought, drawn toward her daughter like a magnet, but the court-appointed guardian intercepted her gently. "Give her a moment," advised quietly, placing a hand on Sarah's arm. "Let her settle, but yes, you should have a brief supervised visit. This is important for both of you." Emma was still stroking Justice's fur, her sobs having subsided into occasional hiccups and trembling breaths. Officer Williams was gently explaining to the little girl that the dog would need to take a short break, that they would see each other again soon. Emma nodded, seeming to understand, though her eyes never left Justice's face. David approached Sarah, his expression one of cautious optimism mixed with professional awareness. "That was significant," he said quietly. "What we just witnessed, Emma's genuine emotional expression, that changes things. The judge saw it. Everyone in this courtroom saw it. But we need to be strategic about how we present this." Sarah barely heard him. She was focused entirely on Emma, on the way her daughter's small shoulders still trembled slightly, on the tear stains on the child's cheeks. A court official gently helped Emma down from the witness chair, and Emma's legs seemed shaky as her feet touched the ground. Guided the little girl toward a small room adjacent to the courtroom where she could have a few minutes with her mother. The reunion was brief but intense. Sarah scooped Emma into her arms and held her, breathing in the familiar scent of her daughter's hair, feeling the small body relax against hers. Emma clung to her mother with the desperation of a child who had been separated for far too long. "I want to come home with you, Mommy," Emma whispered against Sarah's shoulder. "I don't like it at Daddy's house. The nanny is mean sometimes, and Daddy is always working." Sarah's eyes filled with fresh tears, but she forced herself to keep her voice steady. "I know, baby. I know, we're working on that. The judge is listening." But their time was brief. The guardian gently reminded them that Emma needed to have water and calm down before the court reconvened. Reluctantly, Sarah released her daughter, though every fiber of her being wanted to hold on forever. In the hallway, David was waiting with a thoughtful expression. "I need to speak with Judge Richardson's clerk," he said. "I want to request additional testimony. This emotional breakthrough from Emma, we need expert interpretation of what it means." Sarah nodded numbly, still processing everything that had just happened. She felt both hopeful and terrified. What she had just witnessed was Emma's truth, unfiltered, raw, undeniable. But would it be enough? Would a judge really base a custody decision on a child's emotional breakdown, or would legal arguments still prevail? When court reconvened, David stood and made a request. "Your Honor, I would like to recall Dr. Hayes, the clinical psychologist who provided testimony earlier for the petitioner. I believe the events we have just witnessed warrant additional expert interpretation." Judge Richardson exchanged a glance with the courtroom clerk, then nodded. "The court will permit this. Dr. Hayes, please return to the witness stand." Dr. Hayes, a woman in her mid-50s with kind eyes and an air of professional competence, took the stand again. She had been sitting in the gallery, observing the proceedings. It was clear from her expression that she, too, had been profoundly moved by what had occurred during Emma's testimony. "Dr. Hayes," David began, "you specialize in child psychology and have worked extensively with children involved in custody disputes. I want to ask you about the emotional episode we just witnessed." Emma was asked formal, structured questions but remained somewhat guarded and anxious. Then when she noticed Justice, the therapy dog, she experienced what appeared to be a significant emotional release. "In your professional opinion, what does that indicate?" Dr. Hayes took a moment before responding, clearly considering the weight of what she was about to say. "What we witnessed was a child moving from a state of defended anxiety to genuine emotional expression. When children are in formal, high-stress situations, like testifying in court, they often suppress their authentic emotions. They try to provide the right answers or the answers they think adults want to hear. Emma was doing that. She was managing her fear, trying to navigate a complex situation, trying to please the adults questioning her." "And then," David prompted. "And then she encountered an unconditional, non-judgmental presence, the therapy dog. The animal provided what we call psychologically safe space. With that safety, Emma's defenses lowered and her authentic emotional needs emerged. That statement, 'I want my mommy,' that was Emma's true voice, unfiltered by the anxiety and confusion that had been dominating her responses throughout the testimony. Stood for cross-examination, her voice maintaining its professional edge despite the shift in courtroom energy. "Dr. Hayes, couldn't this emotional outburst simply be the reaction of a tired, overstimulated child? Could this not be a momentary emotional response rather than a reliable indicator of her true wishes?" "It's possible that fatigue played a role," Dr. Hayes acknowledged. "However, the consistency of the emotional response, the context in which it occurred, and the age-appropriate articulation of her need, 'I want my mommy,' all suggest this was deeper than simple fatigue. Additionally, in my professional experience, children of Emma's age are remarkably honest when they feel safe enough to express themselves. The therapy dog created that safety." Officer Williams was then called to testify briefly about Justice's training and the well-documented effectiveness of therapy animals in facilitating genuine emotional communication from children. He explained that Justice had been involved in dozens of cases where therapy dogs had helped children access emotions they had been suppressing, emotions that had proven crucial in various legal and therapeutic contexts. "Justice was not trained to manipulate Emma's testimony," Officer Williams explained calmly. "He was trained to provide comfort and safety. What Emma expressed after accessing that comfort, that was her authentic emotional state. The dog simply created the conditions for that authenticity to emerge." Mark Mitchell sat in the gallery, and Sarah couldn't help but notice that he was no longer looking confident and composed. He looked troubled, conflicted. When their eyes met briefly, Sarah saw something in his expression, perhaps recognition of the truth he had been running from, perhaps sadness about what his work schedule and distance from Emma had created. Dr. Hayes continued her testimony, explaining that Emma's desire to be with her mother, combined with her apparent distress about the time she spent in her father's care with the nanny, indicated genuine psychological need for her mother's presence and emotional availability. She explained that the therapy dog moment had essentially unlocked Emma's ability to express what had been true all along, that she wanted and needed her mother. Children benefit from having a primary caregiver who is emotionally available and attuned to their needs, Dr. Hayes stated firmly. Based on the testimony today, combined with the evidence presented earlier about Ms. Mitchell's recovery from depression and her demonstrated commitment to her daughter, Emma appears to have a clear preference for being with her mother, and that preference appears to be rooted in genuine attachment and psychological need. Tried to argue that Emma's statements were unreliable, that the therapy dog had unduly influenced the child, that legal decisions shouldn't be based on a 3-year-old's emotional outburst. But her arguments seemed increasingly hollow in the face of what everyone in the courtroom had witnessed. Judge Richardson asked a series of pointed questions to Dr. Hayes about the reliability of Emma's emotional expression, about whether the therapy dog's presence had compromised the integrity of her testimony, about whether Emma's statements could be given weight in a custody determination. Dr. Hayes answered each question with the authority of someone who had spent decades working with children in exactly these situations. "Your Honor," Dr. Hayes concluded, Emma's emotional expression, facilitated by the therapy dog's presence, revealed what her verbal testimony had been obscured by anxiety. That emotional truth, that she wants to be with her mother and is distressed about their separation, that is reliable and significant information for your consideration. As the testimony concluded and the judge called for another brief recess, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The legal battle was still ongoing, the outcome still uncertain. But what had been made clear, what was now undeniable, was that her daughter loved her, missed her, wanted to be with her. And in a courtroom with expert testimony and a judge who was truly listening, that truth finally had power. The courtroom felt different when everyone reconvened after the second recess. The tension that had characterized the morning had transformed into something else. Anticipation, yes, but also a quieter kind of energy, as if everyone understood that something significant was about to happen. Sarah sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded in her lap, her entire body still trembling slightly from the accumulated stress and emotion of the day. David placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but he remained silent. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to say. Everything that needed to be heard had been heard. Judge Richardson entered from her chambers, and everyone stood respectfully. The judge looked thoughtful, her expression still not revealing anything about which way her decision would fall. She carried a folder, presumably containing her notes from the entire proceeding. She settled into her chair, adjusted her glasses, and looked out over the courtroom with an expression that commanded complete attention. "This has been a complex and sensitive custody matter," Judge Richardson began, her voice carrying the weight of authority and deliberation. "The court has heard extensive testimony regarding the parental fitness of both parties. I have reviewed the psychological evaluations, the employment records, the character witnesses, and all other evidence presented. However, I believe that the most significant and revealing testimony came not from expert witnesses or documents, but from the minor child herself." Sarah's heart began to race. She dared to hope, but she had learned through 18 months of legal proceedings that hope could be dangerous, that outcomes were often unpredictable. "Emma Mitchell is 3 years old," the judge continued. "She cannot lie about complex legal matters. She cannot engage in strategic thinking about her testimony. What she can do is express her authentic emotional needs. During her formal testimony, Emma appeared anxious and defended, as any young child would when placed in a stressful courtroom environment. However, when she was provided with emotional safety through the presence of the therapy animal, her authentic emotional needs became apparent. She clearly and unambiguously expressed that she wants to be with her mother, and that she is distressed about her current living situation. Sat rigidly, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. Sarah could see her jaw clenching, could sense her counsel processing that the judge was moving toward a decision that contradicted everything had argued. The court has also carefully considered the evidence regarding Ms. Sarah Mitchell's mental health history, Judge Richardson went on. Mental illness is not, in itself, a disqualifying factor for custody. Many parents manage mental health conditions while providing excellent parental care. What matters is whether the parent is currently stable, whether they are engaged in appropriate treatment, and whether they are committed to their parental responsibilities. The evidence is overwhelming that Ms. Mitchell meets all of these criteria. She has been medication compliant for 14 months. She has maintained consistent employment. She has secured stable housing. She has completed extensive therapy and continues to be engaged in her mental health care. Most importantly, she has demonstrated an unwavering commitment to rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. Sarah felt tears beginning to form, but she forced them back, not wanting to miss a single word of what the judge was saying. The court recognizes that Mr. Mark Mitchell is also a caring parent, Judge Richardson continued, and Sarah saw Mark shift in the gallery, perhaps hoping the judge would acknowledge his role. However, the evidence indicates that Mr. Mitchell's work schedule has resulted in Emma spending substantial time in the care of a hired nanny rather than with her father. There is also evidence that Emma has expressed dissatisfaction with this arrangement. The court must prioritize the best interests of the child, which means ensuring that the child has access to a primary caregiver who is emotionally available and attuned to her needs. The judge paused, and in that pause, Sarah felt as though the entire universe was holding its breath. Therefore, Judge Richardson announced, and her voice seemed to fill the entire courtroom, this court orders that primary custody of Emma Mitchell be awarded to her mother, Sarah Mitchell, effective immediately. The respondent, Mark Mitchell, will be granted reasonable visitation privileges to be determined by the parties or, if they cannot agree, by further order of this court. Additionally, I am ordering that Emma be granted continued access to justice, the therapy dog, and the county's victim support program to provide ongoing emotional support to the minor during this transition period. This therapy should continue for a period of 6 months, or until such time as the minor no longer requires this support, as determined by her mental health provider. Sarah made a sound, something between a gasp and a sob. The room seemed to shift around her. David gripped her shoulder more firmly, and she realized he was also emotional, his professional composure cracking slightly in response to the victory. Furthermore, the judge continued, I want to state for the record that this case has taught me something important about the nature of family law proceedings. We spend much time in this courtroom discussing evidence, arguing legal points, presenting expert testimony. These things matter, but what matters most is the voice of the child, the genuine, unfiltered emotional truth. Today, we were reminded that sometimes the most powerful testimony comes not from words carefully chosen to support a particular legal strategy, but from the honest emotional expression of a vulnerable human being. I will be implementing changes to how my courtroom handles custody cases involving young children, specifically the expanded use of therapy animals during proceedings. Justice did not testify in words, but his presence facilitated truth-telling in a way that transcended traditional legal mechanisms. The judge looked directly at Emma's guardian. Emma Mitchell has expressed a desire to return to her mother's care, and the evidence supports granting that request. This court believes that placement with Ms. Mitchell is in the best interests of the child. Judge Richardson's gavel came down with a definitive sound. This matter is concluded, pending any further applications regarding visitation arrangements. Court is adjourned. For a moment nothing moved. Then Sarah stood on legs that didn't quite feel like they belonged to her. The courtroom erupted, quietly, as courtrooms do, but with unmistakable emotion. Her supporters in the gallery were nodding, some with tears in their eyes. Sarah's older sister, who had been sitting in the back row, was openly weeping. David embraced Sarah briefly, professional enough to maintain appropriate courtroom decorum but warm enough that she felt his genuine happiness for her. "You did it," he whispered. Emma spoke her truth, and the judge listened. The bailiff approached. "Ms. Mitchell, Emma has been released from the guardianship. You can see her now." Sarah felt her knees nearly buckle at those words. Emma. She was going to see Emma. And this time she wasn't just visiting during a supervised period. This time she was taking her daughter home. Emma was brought into the courtroom from the waiting area where she had been with the guardian. When the little girl saw her mother standing alone at the plaintiff's table, her face transformed. She didn't hesitate. She ran directly towards Sarah, her small legs carrying her as fast as they could move. Sarah scooped her daughter into her arms and held her, feeling Emma's small body collide against hers with the force of desperate love. She buried her face in Emma's hair and allowed herself to cry, not tears of sadness or frustration, but tears of relief, of triumph, of a mother's profound gratitude at being reunited with her child. "We're going home, baby," Sarah whispered. "We're going home. Mommy's taking you home." "Really?" Emma asked, pulling back slightly to look at her mother's face. "Really, really?" "Really, really," Sarah confirmed, kissing her daughter's forehead. "The judge says so. You're coming home with me." Justice, who had remained calm and composed throughout the proceedings, walked over to where Sarah and Emma stood holding each other. Officer Williams allowed the therapy dog to approach, and Justice pressed his head gently against the mother and daughter, as if offering his own blessing to this reunion. Even Judge Richardson, observing from the bench before exiting to her chambers, allowed herself to smile, a rare, genuine smile that acknowledged the profound humanity of what had just unfolded in her courtroom. Justice had done more than provide comfort to a scared child. He had facilitated the restoration of a family. 3 months had passed since that transformative day in Judge Richardson's courtroom. 3 months of Emma adjusting to living full-time with her mother again. 3 months of Sarah rebuilding her relationship with her daughter. 3 months of genuine healing beginning to take root in both their lives. On a bright autumn morning, Sarah and Emma stood in the county courthouse's main hall, preparing to attend a special appreciation ceremony for the Victim Support Program. The building felt completely different now, no longer a place of fear and uncertainty, but a place where something miraculous had occurred. Emma wore a pink dress with white flowers embroidered across the chest, and her hair was pulled back with a matching pink ribbon. She was chattering excitedly as they walked through the courthouse corridor, her voice bright and animated in a way that broke Sarah's heart a little bit when she remembered how quiet her daughter had been just months earlier. The separation and legal battle had stolen something from Emma's childhood, but now, slowly, that joy was returning. "Is Justice going to be there?" Emma asked for the 3rd time, bouncing slightly with anticipation. "Will I get to give him the treat I made?" Sarah smiled and squeezed her daughter's hand. "Yes, baby, Justice will be there. He's going to get a special award for helping children like you." What Sarah didn't say, what she was still processing herself, was how profoundly that single moment with Justice in the courtroom had changed both their lives. That one moment of Emma's authentic emotional expression, facilitated by the therapy dog's presence, had been the turning point. Everything that followed, the expert testimony, the judge's thoughtful consideration, the ruling in their favor, all of it traced back to that pivotal instant when a frightened 3-year-old had found the courage to tell the truth. The courtroom's main hall was already filling with people when Sarah and Emma arrived. Judge Richardson stood near the podium, dressed in her formal judicial robes despite this being an informal ceremony. Officer Williams was present with Justice, who wore a special ceremonial vest adorned with medals and ribbons. The therapy dog moved through the crowd with his characteristic grace, occasionally stopping to receive pets from admirers, but maintaining his professional composure. Dr. Hayes was also present, along with several other mental health professionals who worked with the victim support program. There were families in attendance, people whose lives had been touched by the therapy dogs. Sarah recognized a few faces from the courtroom proceedings, people whose own custody cases had been affected by the presence of these remarkable animals. Judge Richardson approached Sarah and Emma, a genuine warmth in her expression that Sarah had never seen in the courtroom. "Ms. Mitchell, Emma, I'm so glad you could attend." She knelt down slightly to be at Emma's eye level. "Emma, I want to thank you for being so brave in the courtroom. Do you remember that day?" Emma nodded solemnly. "I was scared, but then I saw Justice and I felt better." "That's right," Judge Richardson said, and her eyes glistened slightly. "You taught all of us something very important that day. You taught us that sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is tell the truth about how we feel." She stood and addressed Sarah. "How is Emma doing? How are you both adjusting?" "It's been wonderful," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "Emma's nightmares have stopped. She's sleeping better. She's thriving in her new preschool, making friends, laughing more than I've heard her laugh in years. And Sarah paused, choosing her words carefully. "I'm doing better too. There's still the work of rebuilding our relationship, of helping Emma process everything she's experienced, but the weight of the separation, that's gone. We're home together now, and that changes everything." The judge smiled genuinely. "That's what this is all about. That's why I'm making systemic changes to how my courtroom operates. What happened with you and Emma, it should happen for every child in a difficult situation. Every child deserves to have their authentic voice heard." The formal ceremony began on the courthouse steps. Judge Richardson stood at a podium and addressed the gathered crowd. She spoke about the history of the victim support program, about the importance of therapeutic interventions in legal proceedings, and about the specific case that had catalyzed her commitment to expanded use of therapy animals in custody cases. "3 months ago," the judge said, looking directly at Sarah and Emma, "I witnessed something that fundamentally changed my perspective on family law. A 3-year-old child, through her connection with a therapy dog, was able to express an emotional truth that traditional legal procedures could not access. That truth, the child's authentic need to be with her mother, the child's genuine distress about her current situation, that truth became the foundation for a decision that I believe is profoundly in this child's best interest." Officer Williams was called to the podium to present Justice with an official award. The medal was placed around the dog's neck by Judge Richardson herself, and Justice accepted it with the calm dignity that had come to characterize all his actions. Emma watched with rapt attention, and when Justice was released to move among the crowd, the little girl was the first to approach him. Emma wrapped her small arms around Justice's neck and whispered something into the dog's ear. Sarah couldn't hear the words, but she knew her daughter was expressing gratitude to the animal who had, in many ways, saved her life, or at least saved her from continuing to live separated from the person she loved most. Officer Williams approached Sarah while Emma was occupied with Justice. "I wanted to tell you something," he said. Since Judge Richardson's public statement about the effectiveness of therapy animals in custody proceedings, we've had a remarkable increase in requests for Justice and the other dogs in custody hearings. 15 cases in the past 3 months where therapy animals have been present. In 13 of those cases, the therapy dogs have facilitated similar breakthrough moments where children were able to express their authentic emotional needs. The outcomes have been overwhelmingly positive." Sarah felt tears forming. "So we helped change things. Emma's experience helped other children." "Absolutely," Officer Williams confirmed. "You and Emma and Justice, You've become a symbol for what's possible when we prioritize compassion and authentic connection in legal proceedings. Other jurisdictions are reaching out to us, asking how to implement similar programs. Your daughter's moment of truth has had ripple effects that are going to help countless children. Later in the day, after the formal ceremony had concluded and the crowd had dispersed, Sarah found herself sitting on a bench with Emma, watching as Judge Richardson and Officer Williams discussed something with apparent intensity. The judge was gesturing towards Sarah and Emma, and she was nodding with clear determination. After their conversation ended, Judge Richardson approached. "I wanted to ask your permission for something," she said to Sarah. "I'm creating a formal initiative in my courtroom, the Justice Initiative, named after this remarkable dog. It will expand the use of therapy animals in custody cases, and I would like to feature your case, with your consent and with appropriate protections for Emma's privacy, as a foundational case study for training other judges. Would you be willing to help other families by allowing your story to be used in that way?" Sarah looked at her daughter, at this child who had been brave enough to feel her feelings, who had trusted in a dog's presence enough to speak her truth. "Yes," Sarah said. "If it helps other children find their way back to the people they love, then absolutely yes." Emma held up the drawing she had been working on during the ceremony, a picture of herself, her mother, and Justice, all holding hands under a bright rainbow. She had written her name at the bottom in large, careful letters, and the word love in letters so big they took up half the page. "This is for Justice," Emma announced, "for saving me and Mommy." Officer Williams accepted the drawing with genuine appreciation, and Sarah knew it would be treasured. The image captured something essential about what had happened: a child, a mother, and an animal, united by love and truth. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps, Sarah held Emma close and reflected on how far they had come. 18 months of separation, a contentious custody battle, a moment of breakthrough with a therapy dog. And now this, a new beginning, a family restored, a legal system slightly more humane, and a little girl who had taught everyone around her about the power of authentic emotional expression. Emma looked up at her mother with a question. "Mommy, will we see Justice again?" Sarah smiled. "Yes, baby, we're going to see Justice again. And we're going to keep telling our story so that other mommies and children can be reunited too. Justice helped us find our way back to each other, and now we get to help other families find their way too." Emma seemed satisfied with this answer. She leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, and they sat together in companionable silence, watching the afternoon light play across the courthouse facade. Inside that building, in one courtroom on one remarkable day, love and truth had prevailed, and the ripples of that victory were just beginning to spread.